trial attorney Rich Schoenstein joining us to unpack the legal side of this. So thank you so much, Rich, for joining us. Can you walk us through what these next couple hours will look like, particularly when Mangione gets to Manhattan, assuming it's the criminal courthouse, could be the federal court? Just take us through what to expect in those hours ahead.
Sure. Well, my expectation is in the first instance, he's going to go to the Manhattan criminal court to face the state charges. He's already been indicted by a grand jury, so those charges are pending. He can be arraigned. He'll go into court. He'll formally be charged. He can enter a plea. And at some point, there'll be some discussion. I'm sure he will ask for bail, which I expect will be denied, but there will be some discussion about that. There's been discussion that federal charges are going to be brought, but as far as I know, those haven't been brought yet. So I don't expect to see him in the federal courthouse right away.
We heard from Mangione's attorney this morning, and I want to read part of what she said. Quote, the federal government's reported decision to pile on top of an already overcharged first-degree murder and state terror case is highly unusual, raises serious constitutional and statutory double jeopardy concerns. We are ready to fight these charges in whatever court they are brought. What's your analysis of the charges? Do they seem fair to you?
Yeah, well, she's a great lawyer and a very experienced prosecutor. And I can assure you, when she was serving as a prosecutor, she wouldn't have thought this was overcharging. I mean, this is somebody who killed a man in the back to make a statement. So he's charged with murder in the first degree, which I think is the appropriate charge. I agree with your reporter. It's there. The terrorism part is there because it's a necessary component to get to first-degree murder. Intentional killing in New York is only second-degree murder, and the difference is you can't get life imprisonment without parole unless you get convicted of first-degree murder. So they had to add the terrorism aggravating factor to ratchet it up to first degree so they can try to get life imprisonment without parole.
So I think that's such a valuable explanation in terms of how they got the charge of the sort of evoking terror in the first-degree murder charge. But if you're a prosecutor, how are you able to prove that, as the DA Alvin Bragg said, that the killing was, quote, intended to evoke terror?
Well, I think the theory is that this defendant wanted to send a message with this killing. He had no personal connection that we know about to Brian Thompson. He didn't have an individual gripe with him. This killing was designed to make a statement about the healthcare industry. And you can have whatever opinion you want to have about the healthcare industry, but shooting a guy in the back on the street to make a statement, that's not the way we make statements in this country. And it is to send a message. It is arguably to invoke fear in people who work in that industry and maybe even to persuade them, I don't know, to change what they're doing. And I think that's the kind of argument that's going to be made to support the terrorism charge.
And Rich, you mentioned earlier that Mangione is returning to New York City to these grand jury in criminal court. And you also mentioned really the idea that he will and his legal team will ask for bail. You said you expect that to be denied. Take us through in these 11 counts what you expect the court proceedings to look like, not just later this afternoon, but going forward.
Well, the counts are, so there's the first-degree murder charge that we were just talking about. He also has 2 counts against him of second-degree murder, so that if you can't prove the terrorism component, you could possibly still convict him on second-degree murder. And then the remainder of the charges have to do with possession of a weapon or a forged instrument. And so those are much lesser charges, but they're included because they seem to be related to this crime. He'll be formally arraigned on all of those charges. He'll enter a plea on all of those charges, presumably a not guilty plea. He will make an application, I would assume, for bail. It will be denied, I assume. And then we will enter the period of, preparation for a trial eventually, where the prosecution is going to continue its investigation, assemble its evidence. It has a duty to disclose that evidence to the defense, which will also be carrying on its investigation. There could be interim motions in the court going about the charges and this and that, but mostly I think it's going to be mostly behind the scenes.
Can you help explain, because I was listening, you said presume the not guilty plea once he's back in New York City, and the attorney in Pennsylvania said he would plead not guilty in the case in New York, Pennsylvania, wherever. Can you explain to someone who's not super familiar with law how somebody with the mounting evidence, the investigation that led to his arrest, would plead not guilty in these charges?
So everybody who is brought up on charges in this country, it's one of the great things about our legal system, has a right to have a trial. And the prosecution is required to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, to prove that to a jury and to get a unanimous jury to return a conviction. And we see lots of cases where the evidence looks pretty overwhelming, but the defendant takes advantage of those constitutional rights and requires the prosecution to do its job, to prove all of that stuff. And that's every defendant's right, and that's what every defense lawyer should be doing. That's how the system works, by having the defense challenge that. By the way, one thing we didn't discuss yet, at some point there may be plea discussions between this defendant and the prosecutor. I mean, one possibility is that they will discuss some sort of plea where he would accept guilt on some of the charges in exchange for, perhaps, for not having to spend his whole life in jail.
That is interesting to hear, because you're right, we have not discussed that yet. And one of the things that one of the reasons judges work so hard to keep public opinion out of courtrooms is because of all the coverage of this. The public now associates Luigi Mangione with the murder of Brian Thompson. However, like every American who goes to trial, he is innocent until proven guilty. Can you take us through just the basics in terms of the evidence? We mentioned the not guilty plea. How damning is the evidence, or how difficult a job will it be for the defense to try and get some sort of wiggle room in the reasonable doubt category?
Well, I haven't been able to see the evidence, and I'm going to temper this a little bit, because I too want to see the evidence at trial. I think that's important to see it's presented. My understanding is that he was located in Pennsylvania by authorities with evidence on his person that connects him to the crime. I think a gun, I think some papers that connects him to the crime. I believe there's going to be testimony identifying him as having been in New York, as having stayed at that hostel that was mentioned on the Upper West Side in the days at issue here. I don't think the video evidence at the scene is good enough to prove conclusively it was him. I'm not sure if there's any video evidence of a person escaping on a bicycle that's good enough to prove it was him. So it's going to be largely a circumstantial case. I understand also there's evidence about things he's written or maybe posted on social media about his views on the healthcare industry that would sort of substantiate a motive. Remember, typically you don't have to prove a motive to prove a murder case, but if you're going to argue the guy's a terrorist, then you sort of do have to prove a motive.
Interesting. So you're saying that the addition of the terrorism part of the murder one charge may actually give the prosecution more work to do in terms of the analyzing the evidence to prove the exact wording of that murder one charge.
It absolutely gives the prosecution more work to do. To prove murder two, all they need to prove is he's the guy who did it, that he came to New York, that he had a ghost gun, that he got to the guy on the street and shot him on the back. And no one needs to know why he did that to prove murder two. That is obviously an intentional killing if it happened that way, so it would suffice for the requirements of a murder two charge. But the murder one charge says act of terrorism. And I think you're going to have to peer into his motivation to prove that. I do think it's a tougher sell on the evidence, which is why some people have been critical of the charge.